Hello. Today, this afternoon, we will discuss the future of content monetization, which is solving the broken link between content, so digital publications in our case, so content freely exposed on the web, its identity of content, and its verified attribution. To discuss this matter, I'm pleased to introduce Ronnie Levy, the CEO of the Canadian Copyright Licensing Agency, the organization behind the Attribution Ledger project, which aims at solving this broken link. Ronnie is a champion of creators' rights, bridging the worlds of intellectual property law, content rights management, and blockchain technologies. So Ronnie, welcome to the DPS 2020 online.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Let me just start by sharing my screen. That will just take me one sec. There we go. And at this point, I think you should be able to see my screen. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining me for this hour on this virtual platform. It's perhaps not the way we would have preferred to meet, but it is a really excellent second best solution. And thank you for taking the time, particularly during these uncertain and difficult times. So I look forward to engaging with you, and I think at this point, many of you are old hat to this platform and know how to share your questions via the chat. So as Laurent said, my name is Ronnie Levy, and I am the CEO of Access Copyright, the Canadian Copyright Licensing Agency, and I'm also CEO of Prescient Innovations. And before I jump into the heart of the session, I'm going to give you an overview of what we are going to cover today. So the session objectives is to introduce ourselves. So I will introduce Access Copyright and Prescient and the work that we are doing. I will give you a bit of an insight into the journey that we've had around blockchain and the attribution problem. And I will share our point of view on the attribution problem. I will also share with you our proposed approach to solving it and where we are in terms of next steps. So first about Access Copyright. Access Copyright was created some 30 years ago to deal with an emerging technology that was really challenging the ability of creators and publishers to monetize their work, and that was essentially the photocopier. We are what is called a copyright management organization, and more specifically, a reproduction rights organization. And there are one of us in pretty much, probably in all of your countries. We collect for the reuse of published works, and then we distribute those royalties back to the creators and publishers. And since our creation just over 30 years ago, we've distributed over $450 million back to creators and publishers, both domestic Canadian creators and publishers, as well as foreign creators and publishers. So we're the collective voice here in Canada for authors and visual artists, as well as publishers. And essentially what we do, or what's at the heart of the way we manage the work that we do, is through rights management. And as a result of that experience, we understand the needs of content creators and know the importance of accurately identifying rights holders. Now, Prescient is a wholly owned subsidiary of Access Copyright. It's essentially Access Copyright's innovation lab. And it has the same mandate as Access Copyright. It was created a couple of years ago in order to carry on the work that we were doing on the innovation front. And so Prescient exists to ensure creators and publishers are fairly paid for the use of their works and users have access to trusted content. We believe that the exchange of value generated by content should be transparent, and we are essentially exploring the use of exponential technologies such as blockchain and artificial intelligence to build dynamic ecosystem that reimagine content interactions. So when we look at the future of digital and the future of content, we see that we are in a golden age of content consumption. That's certainly been true with exponential growth and incredible disruption in the content industry, whether it's from creation, production, or distribution of content in the last 15 years. And of course, everybody expects that with the pandemic, that we're actually going to see another incredible wave of disruption as we move towards digital even greater, in greater speed. A huge acceleration of digital adoption is what is expected. So when we look to the future, we ask ourselves three questions. What if creators control how their works were used? What if users could easily discover trusted content? And what if the exchange of value generated by content was transparent? And so these are the questions that kind of directed our inquiry and our research. The problem of misplaced trust. Those that have spent some time or are actively involved in blockchain know that blockchain is often referred to as the trust machine. And the reason for that is that parties who are engaging in an interaction taking place on blockchain don't need to know each other. They don't need to trust each other. They could trust the input that is on the chain because it is immutable. So when we started working on blockchain, now it's almost 4 years ago, it was in the very kind of somewhat early stages, although we're still in the early stages of blockchain and the adoption of blockchain. There are lots of promises that were being made about how blockchain was going to transform the ability of creators to be able to control their works and to monetize their works. And these promises almost seem too good to be true, to be quite honest. And so we asked ourselves, is this really how the world and the technology will unfold into the future? We looked at various content-related projects that were taking place on blockchain, but still couldn't really find the answer to our questions. And so we felt that the best way to get a better insight into understanding this technology and the direction it might take was to maybe play around a little bit with it. And so one afternoon we sat around and we thought, okay, what is it that today's technology makes it difficult or impossible to do, but that the promises of blockchain would make possible? And we came up with the idea of the fan-to-fan sale of an ebook. So essentially what we were looking at doing was to take P2P sharing that almost took down the music industry and to flip it on its head to P2P, peer-to-peer selling. And so in the use case that we were playing around with and that we eventually developed a proof of concept on was the idea that I'm reading a book. And I think because I know Laurent, that he would really, really enjoy the book. So I send the book to Laurent. And Laurent starts reading the book. And sure enough, between my thoughtful recommendation and perhaps the ability to read a couple of chapters of the book, Laurent is hooked and he wants to now commit to the book and read the whole book. But at this point, he is asked to pay for the book. So sure enough, Laurent pays for the book. And when he pays, a smart contract gets executed on the blockchain. In our case, it was the Ethereum blockchain that we did this on. A smart contract gets executed and the author gets a certain percentage of the royalties, a publisher gets a percentage, perhaps a jacket cover artist gets a percentage. And in this use case, the fan, so that would be me, who generated that sale, would also get a reward for having simulated the sale. And so this was a distributed way of selling ebooks from fan to fan. So we built out this proof of concept and it was really, really exciting to actually do it. It worked. It was fun to see it actually work. But one thing that we kept asking ourselves as we worked through the workflow of this type of interaction, we kept asking ourselves, who's going to make sure that the digital asset that is being connected to the smart contract, in our case, it was an ebook, that this ebook and this connection to the smart contract and the wallets that are connected, who are the people that are going to get paid once the transaction happens, are in fact the rightful owners, the people that are entitled to monetize this digital asset. And as we looked at different content projects that were happening, the same thing kept coming up over and over and over again. And that is that they blindly trust, the service providers just blindly trusted that the person that is uploading the content to the smart contract and clicking the yes, I owe the copyright box is in fact the rightful owner and able to do this. So there was this blind trust that was taking place, and it's a process that is all too familiar because it's how it works today. And so we looked at this and we called it the junk in, junk out issue. And essentially that if the rights information used in digital services is not reliable, everything that happens after simply cannot be trusted. And the difficulty, of course, is ensuring it's the digital services being able to ensure proper attribution. And most digital services, their starting point is this blind trust in creator's claim, or in the person that's uploading the work's claim. And that, of course, challenges the integrity of the services, and also the integrity, and compromises the interests of both creators and consumer. So our key learning from this proof of concept, besides for saying, you know what, this blockchain thing, it's going to be real. That we can definitely see how interactions are going to get transformed through the use and the increasing use of this technology. Our key learning, however, was that the next era of digital interaction might in fact cement the existing challenges caused by the internet, which is rampant piracy, monetization of content by someone other than the lawful owner, and essentially compromising the interest also of the end user. So to solve the attribution problem, we believe that there needs to be a deliberate and concerted approach by the industry to attribution. And the way we define attribution is the ability to connect a creative work, so a digital asset, a digital file that is circulating at any time while it's being circulated in this distributed ecosystem, the ability to create that, to connect that asset to the lawful creators and rights owner, and to do so in a reliable and authoritative manner. So that's where the attribution ledger problem and the need to solve the attribution problem for us came to be. And so the attribution ledger project essentially creates an immutable connection between the creative work, the metadata about the work, and the entity or person authorized or enabled to use that work. So when we looked at what is necessary for a transaction to happen in a distributed environment, a transaction around content that we can trust, we see 4 elements that need to be there, and that need to be persistently linked. We need the content file, we need identifier about the content, we need metadata about the content, and we need the rights holders. And the problem today is that these 4 elements to a transaction around content are not persistently connected. They may start off connected, but eventually they often get disconnected. And then in a distributed environment, it is often hard, if not impossible, to reconnect it. So since the 4 elements are not connected, most digital services today simply trust that the person providing the work is entitled to do so. And as I mentioned, if the attribution information used by digital services is not reliable, everything that happens after that cannot be trusted. And we also believe that the next era of digital interaction might cement the existing challenges caused by the internet if the attribution problem is not addressed. So what we propose as a kind of a vision for the solution is to have an attribution ledger, which in a way sits between the content creators and the digital services. The attribution ledger would ensure that the content circulating on digital services is reliably and authoritatively attributed. At a very high level, there are kind of three components to an attribution system. There is the ledger itself, which provides an open and transparent system, which immutably connects the work or its digital representation, the metadata about the work, and the entity or person able to authorize the use of the work. There needs to be, for this attribution system to work, a robust, trusted, transparent governance structure, which oversees the creation and operation of the system. It would do things such as put in place processes and protocols for creation, verification, and use of verified attribution, the onboarding and offboarding of participants in the attribution system, the roles and privileges associated to the different stakeholders or active participants in the attribution system. And the third element, which is also quite important, there needs to be a dispute resolution process that addresses exceptions that arise from attribution claims when they are inconsistent. And so just to give you a little bit more of a flavor of how this attribution system might be structured, here are kind of the key actors in an attribution system. You've got the claim registrants, which is the entity that submits an attribution claim for verification. You have the attestation providers, and those are the entities that verify the attribution to attest that the attribution is in fact correct or the process has been followed for proper attribution. There are exception managers, and that is to deal with conflicts around attestation claims. And then ultimately, and importantly, you have the attestation users, and those would be the services that rely on attestation in order to run parts of their offerings. So when we started looking and working with the concept of an attribution ledger and an attribution system, with the goal of connecting these four elements together, one of the things that we started doing early on was to work with the International Standard Content Code. And I'm going to spend a few minutes saying a few words about the International Standard Content Code, which is an important element of being able to connect all of the four components of a transaction. So what are the characteristics of an ISCC? Many people on their call are going to be very familiar with fingerprinting technology as well as identifiers themselves. And the ISCC is an interesting beast. It's in fact a cross between an identifier and a fingerprint. And you could think about it, we sometimes refer to it as content code because when we talk about it as an identifier, then people have the paradigm of identifiers in their mind, and that's not quite the right paradigm that you need to be working with. And when we talk about it as a fingerprint, people have the paradigm of fingerprinting technology in their minds. And again, that's not exactly the paradigm that you should be working with. So we're trying to move away from those two terms and call it content code. But let me say a little bit about how it works. The ISCC essentially uses the digital file itself in order to create the ISCC. So it's the output of multiple fingerprints of the digital content file. And it's in fact 4 different fingerprint using 4 different fingerprinting algorithms that outputs the ISCC. It is designed for a distributed digital environment. And that is really, really important to keep in mind. And that's what's so transformative and different about this ISCC and how it works. And I'll come back to it in a minute. It allows the matching of identical or near identical content files, as well as, and this is whether or not they are in different formats. It can be generated by anyone who has the digital content file. I think that is a really important element of the ISCC and why it is designed, purposely designed for a distributed environment. So let's say I have a PDF and I've shared the PDF with all of you on the call, and then you've shared it with a whole bunch of other people. And then at one point, we want to know whether or not we're dealing with the same file. There's no identifier on this. There's no no way for us to be able to check without sending the PDFs back to each other in order to test whether or not we still have the same files, or whether we're dealing with the same files. What the ISCC would allow you to do is to take this digital file and push it through, I call it the ISCC sausage making machine. So you upload it to the ISCC, to a site that has an ISCC generator, and out will come an ISCC. And that ISCC can then be compared to the ISCC generated by any one of you that has done the same thing with the PDF that you have in your file. And this comparison between these two ISCCs, which is done in a distributed fashion or remotely without us sharing the file per se, allows us to be able to tell whether these are identical or near identical files. So the ISCC codes are not assigned by anyone or to anyone. So anybody in the ecosystem can take a digital file and get an ISCC from that digital file. And so can then use that outputted ISCC to compare it to somebody else's generated ISCC from that digital file. Now, if you take this one step further and you create a reference database for ISCCs, so you connect the ISCC generated by this PDF to a certain rights holder or to a certain metadata about the file, then you have what essentially is a ledger to identify the authorized works before they are transacted upon. So the attribution ledger would provide the overall governance for creation, verification, and use of verified attribution. It would develop and implement protocols and guidelines for verified attribution. It would bring together the ecosystem for issuing and using verified attribution, and it would build and maintain processes and the core technology infrastructure. The benefits is that it would enable new economic structures that will drastically rewrite the way commerce is conducted in a distributed online environment. It has the ability of providing transparent line of sight to creators into how creative works are transacted upon. It will enable new user interactions that can generate new economic value for both the creators and the consumers of the content. Digital services would reliably be able to verify the authenticity and integrity of content. And it would provide the governance and tools that enable open and transparent attribution. So in order to demonstrate the value of the attribution ledger and seed its adoption, we are building two digital services that use verified attribution information provided by the ledger. So the ledger itself is the underlying infrastructure, and two services sit on top of it. Fanship is a fan activation platform inspired by our proof of concept, but doesn't operate exactly like our proof of concept, but it was inspired by it. It's a fan activation platform where authors and publishers can engage directly with their fans and facilitate and stimulate meaningful book recommendations that result in sales. And when the sales occur on the platform, it is connected to the attribution ledger. The Imprimo is it creates a certificate. Imprimo creates a certificate of ownership for physical works and tracked copyright ownership. This is for visual art, so it's a trace and tracking service for visual arts. So we're working on these services, and if you'd like an MVP of the attribution ledger and these services that sit on top of it, we're doing that at Prescient, and we're doing it particularly in Primo with some of our members and partners in the visual arts community in Canada. But we fully recognize that the only way that this vision is truly going to become a reality, and that we're going to solve the attribution problem, is if there is an industry-wide effort. And so what we're looking to bring together is an industry consortium around this vision to pick up from the work that we've done so far and to bring it forward. We're looking at putting together a steering committee that will direct the next steps of this project. So that was kind of the heart of what I wanted to share with you. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now and see if there are any questions or comments.
Yes, there are. So the first question I will have will be, do you have already contacts about your projects, because you've got 2 projects at the moment, with other copyright licensing agencies in the world?
So the projects that we're doing right now, we are doing them just with Access Copyright, but we've been sharing and talking to copyright licensing agencies throughout our journey. So way back 3 years ago, when we started exploring blockchain, we started working with copyright agencies. So we've been sharing our journey and the results of our work with the agencies in the UK, in France, in Australia, in the US.
And what are the results for now? Do you think that it seems that you are one of the most technical advanced copyright agency, at least I have met. So do you have in front of you people who are ready to invest time and technical skills in that, or are they listening at the moment?
So there has been a show of interest. So people have put their hands up to say, yeah, we want to be involved. And right now we're at the stage of figuring out what are the next steps and how do we bring that participation into the project. But the answer is yes, there are some people that have put up their hands and said that they're interested in participating. So there is that. Exactly what that looks like is still, remains to be worked through.
And I imagine that the technology part is not the most difficult part to solve. In fact, it seems that the dispute solver, all the organization around is maybe involves people. So is maybe the most complex part. What do you think about?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. The governance, so that whole part that you call the people, the people part of the project, it's the governance. And I think that is, in fact, the most difficult aspect of the project is figuring out the governance, bringing people together, having a common shared vision of how the project can unfold is the biggest challenge. And as well, the biggest opportunity too.
Sure. But if you want this project to succeed, don't you need to have copyright agencies or people from all countries coming?
Absolutely. I agree with you completely. It needs to be, this project cannot be a Canadian project. It needs to be a global initiative if it is to succeed. Absolutely.
Do you have already the container, the organization to host people like that? No.
No, not yet. No, it's still early stages.
What is the current stage of the Fanship project? Because you have done a prototype, but now it seems that you are almost ready to go.
Yeah, we are actually. We are weeks away from actually opening it up to the public so that people can interact with Fanship. We are in the process of onboarding creators and publishers on the Fanship platform. And so it's very, very exciting. We are literally away.
Is it something that is already international, or at the moment will you launch it at the Canadian level?
Because it is hard to limit the fan interactions, so fan interactions can happen from anywhere, but in terms of working with the content producers and authors, those are at this point just Canadian.
And will you communicate about the first results so that you can embark and promote it to?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
How much time do you need before you can communicate? I imagine that you need at least 4-6 months to be sure it starts.
Yeah, probably something like that would seem reasonable. But we'll be promoting the Fanship service more actively in the coming weeks, really.
Okay, that's great. And how will it work in practice? I mean, will it work from Facebook, Instagram? How will people?
For Fanship itself?
Mm.
Okay, so Fanship is separate from the Attribution Ledger. As I pointed out, it's a service that sits on the Attribution Ledger and ensures that the content which then gets used has been properly attributed. So that's the connection to the Attribution Ledger. Now, in theory, you could have Fanship not at all connected to the Attribution Ledger. And then you would have, similarly to today, you never really know whether the content that is circulating on the service has been done through an properly attributed fashion. So Fanship itself, so I shared with you the proof of concept, which use a smart contract to redistribute royalties. Fanship does not use that. There's no smart contracts being used on Fanship. At this point in time, we are not using smart contract either on Fanship or on Imprimo. The only thing we are using blockchain for is for kind of that database component of it, of making sure that the connections between the assets and the rights information is done in a way that you can't change, or that is tamper evident. But we're not using smart contracts at this point.
Okay, and for the end user, how we will interact with the system?
So for Fanship, you would interact with the system the way you interact with any other service online. So just off the web, you interact. The user never knows there's blockchain being used.
Sure.
It's completely in the background. It's really part of the piping, if you'd like, of Fanship itself. And it's a way of ensuring that the content which gets circulated via Fanship is in fact properly attributed. But it's completely in the background.
So we will be able to put a link to this session when you launch the system for
Absolutely.
people.
I would love that.
Come back
Absolutely.
and see your video and see the link to the real projects going on. That's
and see how the attribution works as well.
Great. We've got a question from Robert Bobby Desmond saying that the blockchain is notoriously anti-central. How are you adapting the technology to be more capable of a semi-centralized management?
Yeah. So what is distributed is the ledger itself, but the governance of the ledger does not need to be distributed. So it's the governance that is centralized but global, right? With a kind of more with structures that are more familiar to us than, for example, the governance of Bitcoin. But the database is distributed. The participants for in the attribution ledger are also going to be distributed and global.
Okay.
So
yes,
the infrastructure is distributed, but the governance is more central.
It's not. I understand. We talked about the status of the Friendship project, but we didn't talk about the status of the Imprimo project. Where it is at the moment? Where is it at the moment?
It's also about to be launched. So for Imprimo, we got a fund from the Canada Council for the Arts to build the first phase. And now we got a second fund to build a second phase of Imprimo. So we're still in the process of identifying exactly where we're going to go with Imprimo in phase 2 with our partners, but it's also about to be launched. So it's all really, we're just kind of wrapping things up now, and then we'll figure out what the launch plans are.
Right. There is a question from Sebastian Post. What is your view on the future of the blockchain technology for media industries in general? And what is the difference to the Web 2.0 as we know? And why should they look into the technology now? I don't know exactly who is the they, but why should they look into the technology now?
Yeah, I think he's referring to the industry or the media industry or content industry generally. So I think there's a lot of people, blockchain had there was a hype around blockchain, and then things calmed down a bit, and people are saying, no, that was just a hype and it's gone away. I think it's kind of like, the 2000 hype around the .com bubble, and then it exploded, and then all the work continued. But it was more under the radar, and then all of a sudden, 10 years later, we're walking into cabs, we're walking into cars, private people's cars using Uber and that kind of thing. So I think that's where we're at with blockchain as well. There was this hype, everybody got excited about blockchain, everybody was paying attention to it. Partly it was driven by greed and what was happening with the cryptocurrencies. And then the cryptocurrencies went down, everybody walked away and said, well, that's it. There's really, the technology is not really delivering on its promise. There are a lot of projects happening and that are in production right now that leverages blockchain, but it's a lot more like the pipe. It's the infrastructure that is being built. The distributed environment and the blockchain, the promises of blockchain, I think are real. Blockchain will be a thing. And if the content industry doesn't pay attention to it right now and participate in its evolution, then it will wake up 5 or 10 years from now, and they will have kind of missed the opportunity to have been able to shape this new era of digital information, innovation, and disruption. So it's absolutely vital to not just sit back and let this technology to go and evolve, but to actually be active participants and use the technology as a way of understanding it and learning where it may take you and where it may take your business models.
Great. A question about the metadata. You said that, in fact, on one side, you've got the content and an identifier for the content, which is the ISCC, because it's auto-generated, I would say. On the other side, you've got the copyright owner, which is identified and trusted via this governance body. And in the middle, you've got metadata about the content. Yeah. In fact, what can you put inside this metadata, or what do you intend to put there?
Yeah, so ultimately, I think the attribution ledger needs to be connected to the other kind of metadata agencies and identifiers that are out there, right? It will not sit outside of the ISBN, the ISSN, and all of the other identifiers that exist. So it needs to be part of that web and draw in the metadata, or is connected to. If it's not drawn in, it's linked back to the other metadata that is out there.
And do you think that among these metadata, there could be some sort of link to the license that somebody could buy to use this content?
Yeah, ultimately that is possible. I don't see that as kind of the first order business. I see that as a second order. I think we need to get this right before we could go to the licenses, but absolutely. The licenses themselves, if you'd like, is metadata. The way the book is metadata, the license is metadata. It is, if you'd like, an item that is to be tracked and referenced to in an immutable way so that people know what are the terms that are linked to that license at any point in time, and perhaps that license can get exchanged as well. So I definitely do see that licenses can be treated as metadata that is immutable and searchable and etc.
And I suppose that this question of license metadata, maybe you have discussed it with the European people about the EU copyright directive that will come. Are there some discussions about that already, or is it only in the cloud?
So we are talking about it with other partners from Europe that are very familiar and very active in trying to figure out where these EU copyright directives go and what is the infrastructure that is needed in order to enable these new provisions in the directives to have meaning and be actionable for sure. And there's been a lot more interest, particularly from the EU, to this vision of the attribution ledger as a result of the EU directive, for sure. Even though we started working on this before the EU directive, if you'd like, has created kind of this impetus, this acceleration, and this attention on the project because of how it is part of the solution that is needed in order to make these new provisions real and useful.
And I had another question about, we have seen that the identifier of content is an ICC. What is the identifier of a copyright owner? Because is it something that is internal to the system? Is it something that is an international standard?
That is a very good question. And one thing that I didn't expect when I started working on this project, I guess a little bit, I jumped into it a little bit naively, is that there is a need, an absolute need, to identify a lot more of the items or the entities. Let's call them entities in the ecosystem. The rights holders, but also the contributors, and there are existing standards. There are existing identifiers in different content area for these entities, and all of those need to be able to work together in this ecosystem. So there's a lot more connection parts outside of the attribution ledger that need to happen for it to be an effective system, and also one for adoption to take place. So you don't want to recreate existing identifiers or existing infrastructure and metadata that is down. You want to complement it and not to recreate it. And so there needs to be a lot more work in understanding how do you stitch all of this together so that it complements it and it fills the gap that right now exists, as opposed to trying to supplant any of the existing parts of the system that is there and that's taken years to take place and to adopt, and that is working relatively well.
Okay, and do you think that there is a huge amount of work still to do? Do you think that both the Canadian state and the European Union could give grants for such a thing?
That is my hope.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yes, we've gone through the different questions. If there is no more coming now, I think that it was very clear. So in the chat, you can leave some information if you are interested knowing more about this project. So if you want Ronnie to come back to you, just leave a small note in the chat and we will find you.
That would be fantastic. I really do encourage anybody on the call that wants to learn more about the project to leave a message in the chat so that we can reach out to them.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, Ronnie. It was a great pleasure to have you today. Very interesting, and I really hope that we will be able to go forward with this project.
Yes, thank you very much.
Have a nice day.
Bye.